Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And I'm so delighted to come to you this evening to share with you a fabulous story. This is part 2 of our story. If you haven't heard part 1, please click on the description because you don't want to miss out. It's another fabulous story. And as I always say, just like a broken record, nothing in this world is better than a good story. Let us know what the weather is like in your part of the world. Is it getting warmer? Is it getting colder? I'd love to hear from you. So let's continue with our story. Erwin continued. My uncle clandestinely squirreled my mother out of the United Kingdom, away from her parents' home in Knightsbridge, at their request. She emigrated to America to live with her uncle and aunt at Stana, where his wife Mary had inherited the grandiose mansion from her own father. My mother's uncle felt very certain that his niece's life was in very grave danger, and stealing her out of the United Kingdom seemed like a very sensible thing to do at the time. My mother lived in Stana with her uncle and aunt, and in later years she remained there but married my father, where she gave birth to me. I was sent to boarding school in both England and then to Edinburgh University in Scotland. Suffice to say, my mother never got to play the lead role in Swan Lake, which had been her biggest dream. But if that man, Theodore, had any inkling that she was alive, well, there is no telling what he would be capable of doing. He was a murderer from the very beginning, I can assure you of that. And so my mother has kept a low profile over the years, never letting the cat out of the bag about who she really is. If your mother is elderly now, surely she doesn't believe this man Theodore, whatever his name is still after her after all this time. Isn't that rather absurd? Time is a great healer, is it not? Surely the incident is long forgotten about. If your mother is as elderly as you claim she is, then surely she doesn't believe this man Theodore, whoever he is still after her after all this time. Isn't that rather absurd? Time is a great healer, and surely the incident has long since been forgotten about. And even this Theodore character, well, he must be getting long in the tooth now. Surely it's a bit late in the day for him to seek revenge on your mother. Oh, believe me, Theodore is very much alive. I heard they suspect he's heavily involved in a drug cartel. If he got word that my mother was alive, even though she's elderly, he'd finish her off in a second. The thing is, he believes my mother died in a house fire in Knightsbridge. We believe he hired an assassin to bring down the residence in flames. Theodore falsely assumed my mother was in the house with her parents at the time. The newspapers believed my mother had died in that fire. A few strings were pulled in high places to perpetrate that kind of story. It wasn't true, of course. In fact, there were reports in the London Evening Standard, the Sun and the Daily Mail, with headlines that read, Sadler Wells, prima ballerina, dies in inferno. I hasten to say no one was in the house when it burnt down to a cinder. My uncle believed Theodore orchestrated the entire crime, believing emphatically that he'd killed my mother. My mother returned to Stana, well, that's where she came to live, soon after the event. My uncle claimed she was a daughter from another relationship. People believed that. No one asked any awkward questions. And she has remained undercover over the years, and has become somewhat of a recluse, especially after my father died. I think she lives with a perpetual fear that Theodore will find her, when at this stage in her life it is significantly less likely. But try telling that to my mother. With the greatest of respect, Mr. Mackenzie, please call me Erwin. With the greatest of respect, Erwin, where do I come into the story? I just don't see it somehow. My mother is elderly. She's stuck in the mansion at Stana, all on her own. She definitely needs a companion. But I need to hire someone that I can fully trust, and more to the point, that my mother can trust. Over the years, my mother has had to be very guarded about who she befriends, even after all this time. It takes one person to spill the beans on her, and it gets right back to Theodore. God only knows what he would do. His sister Rosie died a couple of years ago, and his hatred towards my mother is immense, still as fresh as the day he first felt his hatred towards her. He blames her for ruining his sister's life. If he had any notion that my mother was alive, there would be hell to pay. I've heard terrible things about this man, terrible things. One man let him down in a drug deal and ended up losing his head to Theodore, and that head was delivered to his mother's front door in a supermarket bag. Of course, the police have never arrested him. That's the kind of really wicked individual we're dealing with here. My mother has every right to be terribly afraid of him. More to the point, a rumour recently circulated around London that the ballet dancer who pushed his sister down the stairs was still very much alive and had not been killed in that inferno in Knightsbridge. And even in his elderly years, Theodore went completely mental. "If I find her, I'll kill her myself." So you can see, my mother's life is very much still in danger. She needs a companion. The way I see it, you have much in common, the both of you, being falsely accused of something you did not do, both hiding away from public scrutiny, both desiring to remain anonymous. I think my mother could trust you, and you could trust her. I would pay very handsomely for you taking care of her, but you need to get rid of your cell phone, credit card, and everything to avoid any paper trail. Otherwise, the press will catch up with you, and your cover will be blown. And the last thing my mother needs is a hive of inquisitive hornets buzzing over Stanhope Hall, as before you know it, her identity will be uncovered, and Theodore will find out that the woman he thought crippled his sister all those years ago is very much alive, and there is no telling what a man like him is capable of doing. But how do you know I'm innocent? Believe me, I've done my research. I know. More to the point, I'm a very good friend of your father-in-law's. He's a good man, your father-in-law. He believes you need to disappear before you're eaten alive by the press. He thinks you would be the perfect companion for my elderly mother. I wholeheartedly agree. I believe the two of you will have much in common, and will get along famously. Your father-in-law will put out the word to the press that the last time he communicated with you, you were suicidal. They will think you topped yourself, and will hopefully quit looking for you. Your father-in-law is one of those men that has likely never told a single lie in his entire life. But he believes these circumstances are extenuating, and will stop at nothing to protect you, even if it means being malleable with the truth. For the record, he absolutely knows you're innocent, that you had no knowledge of Terry's shenanigans. He knew his son was a bad egg from the very beginning, who only presented you his very best side, so that you would naively, very innocently fall hopelessly in love with him. Your father-in-law wanted to warn you about Terry at the time, when you first married his son. He knew there was a furtive, duplicitous side to his son. He thought a good woman like you might turn the bad apple into a good one. Let's just say when his son was growing up, he stole a plethora of money from your father-in-law. But he said nothing about it, but watched his son's fraudulent actions with a great deal of sorrow in his heart. No father likes to see the son they've invested so much hope in become such an unscrupulous, unsavoury character. In truth, he never envisaged his son would go this far, in ruining the lives of so many innocent people. And now you are being blamed by mere association with him. Your friends have abandoned you. You have absolutely no money. Your house will be ripped away from beneath your feet. Your reputation is in tatters. No one will want to employ you, given who you are, and anyone who knows you will tear you apart limb for limb, like those poor women in the Salem witch trials. People can be cruel. Funny you should mention the Salem witch trials. I was thinking about those poor women today, probably because I could relate to what they must have felt for being falsely accused of something they didn't do. It's not a good feeling to have your credibility eaten up in a single mouthful. It hurts people believing that I could be so grotesquely evil, when I'm anything but. You, my dear lady, are most certainly not evil. You are just a victim, like all those people who lost their money in those investment schemes. But there is a way out. I can help you to vanish, pay you to be a friend to my mother. You are both like battered fish in a goldfish bowl, suffering from the same sorry emotional injuries. I believe you will get each other, have each other's backs. The both of you want to keep a wary distance from intrusive eyes. In the small town near where we live, my mother is occasionally seen there. She will introduce you to the locals as one of her grandchildren, who came to stay with her. No one will suspect that it's not true. How does your mother feel about all this? I asked. At first she pooh-poohed the very idea, thought it was insanely ridiculous. But now she sees you have much in common, and that both of you, being in a similar plight, will watch each other's backs. My mother became very lonely after my father died. She certainly could do with a friend, and you would fit the bill nicely. I think the two of you, as I've said before, will get along nicely. I understand at one time you too were a prima ballerina, with big dreams and aspirations, much like my mother. But your career was inadvertently cut short. What happened there? I looked up at Irwin with a look of regret in my eyes. Yes, it's true. I wanted to be a ballerina with all my heart. Let me see, said Irwin. I think I know where this is going, he said, narrowing his eyes suspiciously. You married Terry. He convinced you to give it all up, to give up that fabulous career you had as a prima ballerina. Narcissists are very good like that. Once they get their claws into you, the man who could masterfully persuade people to part with their life savings didn't have any problem in convincing you to give up a bedazzling career, I imagine. I hung my head in shame. Yes, you're right. He did convince me to leave the ballet. And honestly, I don't know how he did that. I can't even remember, but let's just say, at the time, it seemed to make an awful lot of sense. You were quite the dancer, I believe, Mrs. Stewart. I read some headlines about you in the Evening Standard, saying you were a rising talent who expressed yourself beautifully in dance. Don't you see, Mrs. Stewart? You have far more in common with my mother than you realize. And being from different generations, you will only bring out the very best in each other. Your youth will invigorate my mother, I'm quite sure. And in turn, her wisdom will help ground you. And right now, Mrs. Stewart, you need grounding. If you don't mind my saying, I'm sure you have looked better. Those dark circles under your eyes and the baggy clothes you're wearing suggest to me that you haven't been doing much eating or sleeping. You're in a bad way, Mrs. Stewart, and I believe that Stana will lift you out of your lugubrious melancholia. It's a vast estate, situated on rugged, wild, untamed countryside. It is exactly what you need. The place is a tonic. How do you know I'm in a nervous state? I asked him. Is it that obvious? Well, I'm afraid it is. Not to put too fine a point on it. But who would not be in a state in your circumstances? Look at you. You're restless, twitching all the time, very anxiously. I can see you're restless. You're like a bird with a broken wing. Anyone with eyes can see that you're falling apart. 1 week later, I never believed that I'd end up living in a magnificent 3-story mansion like Stanhope Hall, that looked like a fairy tale castle out of a children's book, or a grandiose doll's house on a large scale, that oozed history like the butter on a hot cross bun, and boasted the dignified resplendence of 18th century Victorian architecture, even though it was not an original 18th century building. But the senses can be easily fooled, and you'd never have known otherwise. It possessed an ornate exterior, with typical towers and turrets, steep gabled roofs, and highly decorated woodwork. It was a direct representation of the Stanhope family castle in Scotland that had belonged to the family in the 1800s, and was recreated by the Stanhopes in Minnesota as almost a duplicate carbon copy in the 1920s, but done on a much smaller scale. For indeed the original castle in Scotland had boasted hundreds of rooms. Lady Stanhope perceived, after her family emigrated to the United States, that if they couldn't go to their beloved castle in Scotland, why not bring the castle to them? So that's what they did, building the place not too far from the great Lake Superior. The stone, wood and brick mansion had been skillfully built on acres and acres of wild, untamed, sprawling countryside that stretched out rather presumptuously like a large yawn, and was magnanimously sprinkled with a plethora of indigenous evergreen trees that gathered together in large, lofty congregations. Spring was slowly hemorrhaging into summer, and those trees that were deciduous had boasted a confetti of blossoms that had now developed crisp green leaves. The early blossoms had long gone. It was a sumptuous feast for my eyes, to be surrounded by such prepossessing beauty, and to be thousands of miles away from Chicago, where instead of being greeted to the tall, concrete, high-rise skyscrapers, I could see trees, and instead of the humming sounds of the traffic, I could hear the pretty trills of the birdsong, the rustling of the breeze blowing through the trees. Suddenly I felt as free as a bird, able to stretch out my wings and soar up in the cornflower blue skies, no longer disturbed by the sharpened beaks of the raptors in Chicago, bombarding me at my front door with their obtrusive questions, so that I remained hidden behind the walls of my home that had become like a prison. Now it would seem, at long last, I was away from public scrutiny, and no one knew who I was or where I was. I had abandoned credit cards, not that they would have been any use to me anyway, and identification documents, and as far as anyone knew, I was as good as dead, and I was eager to celebrate the crisp taste of my newfound freedom. When Irwin first introduced me to his mother Sylvia, there was an instant connection between the two of us which I never expected, for with our shared passion for ballet and the natural world, it instantaneously cemented our friendship. The woman rather reminded me of Lady Mary's mother in Downton Abbey, Cora, the Countess of Grantham, for she possessed not only similar facial features, but airs and graces. She dressed in clothes that were much like the designs that Cora would have worn, made of fabrics that you rarely get to see these days, clothes that have long since abandoned our modern-day fashion trends, probably because they'd be too expensive to make. Even though Sylvia was frail, she was slender, and walked with the grace of a ballerina. "Oh, my darling, I've heard all about you, and about your sorry state of affairs," Sylvia had said to me when I first arrived. She had thrown her arms around me lovingly. "You and I are two birds of a feather that the fox caught but never broke us, despite his cruel intentions. And now you're seeking sanctuary here with me at Stanhope Hall. Isn't that wonderful? The fox shall never find you here. But even though you are here, and this is a wonderful, wonderful place, you are not completely safe. None of us are, I'm afraid." Sylvia had made this rather disquieting proclamation while I was seated with her in the grandiose wood-panelled breakfast room, with its gilded portraits of ancestors long past that appeared to be staring at us from the rich oils on canvas. We were seated on wing chairs behind the long wooden table, surrounded by a very grand fireplace that must have looked magnificent in the winter when a fire was burning away merrily in the hearth. It was a warm day. I couldn't help thinking what a dreadful pity it was that we couldn't enjoy a fire, because it would have looked so good in that crate. At the time of this astonishing confession that came from Sylvia, we were being served a very glamorous tea in fine china by one of the staff that lived on the premises, a young lady called Melanie. "Thank you, Melanie. That will be all," said Sylvia, raising her frail arm in the air. She was trembling as she held her delicate porcelain teacup in her hand. She looked at me through her piercing but very beautiful blue eyes. "I'm so very glad you've come here, my darling. I have felt so awfully alone being here all day. at Stanhope Hall, in such a grand mansion such as this, not being able to share my heart with anyone, but in you, my dear. I am glad to say I have found a kindred spirit. But even though you've come to live here at Stanhope Hall with me, and are safe from the predators pursuing you in Chicago, who will never find you here, there is another predator that will be out for your blood that you must be incredibly wary of. It would be remiss for me not to warn you about this, for being forewarned is forearmed, as my aunt used to say. Let's just say this predator lurks in the woods and has been hounding the Stanhope family since the 1920s, when Stanhope Hall first came into existence. I hasten to say the Lord and Lady Stanhope's first child was killed by this predator. Of that I am in no doubt. But everyone who has lived in this house, especially if they're in a vulnerable state of mind, knows to be very careful and very alert when they go ambling around in the woods. And the same needs to be applied to you. Oh, don't you worry about me, Sylvia. I'll be absolutely fine, I said, chuckling, as I took a sip of my tea. I know exactly what you're thinking, and I don't blame you, Sylvia. Chicago girl, doesn't know a thing about the countryside, hasn't got a clue about the wild animals out there. And you're right, I don't know very much. I probably do need to be educated in these things, but I'm not a complete imbecile. At least I hope I'm not. I'd like to think I'm aware of the dangers of bears, mountain lions, wolves and coyotes. If that's what you're talking about, I said, briefly glancing out through the large glass window panes that overlooked the spectacular rolling hills and rugged views of the countryside, fully appreciating its unspoilt beauty. It clearly was a haven for much indigenous wildlife, much that I suspected could possibly be predatory. That is not what I'm talking about, my dear, said Sylvia gingerly. I think you've got your wires completely crossed. You have fully misunderstood me. Now I noticed that her teacup was violently shaking in her hands, as her whole body trembled like a blancmange jelly. I was amazed she managed to keep her tea in the cup, as the milky beverage was literally swinging inside its porcelain confinement, threatening to spill all over Sylvia's long cocktail dress. I'm talking about something far more sinister, I'm afraid. Have you heard of the Wendigo? She bristled as she said the word. When Sylvia mentioned the word Wendigo, I'm embarrassed to say I snorted with laughter and was unable to hide the irrepressible laugh that emanated from the back of my throat, that I so desperately tried to suppress. Sylvia was clearly more than just a little eccentric. She was rather cuckoo, I suspected. Did she honestly expect me to believe that a creature of myth like that, which absolutely did not exist, was roaming around in her woodgroves and imposing a real threat to my life? Was she honestly expecting me to take her seriously on this? I knew it was rude to make fun of her comments, so I tried to look as seriously sober as I could. But I'm not sure I was pulling it off, as I'm certain I was wearing a walloping large smirk on my face. But I mean, could you blame me? The Wendigo, please. Did Sylvia honestly think I was that gullible, that naive, that impressionable? You don't believe me, dear, do you? Said Sylvia, reaching out to squeeze my arm affectionately. Her steely gaze remained resolutely, steadfastly fixed on mine. How can I blame you for that? When I first came here to Stanhope Hall, and my uncle warned me of such things, I was very naive at the time, and unequivocally, much like yourself, believed a Wendigo was an ancient legend. But I was to learn how wrong I was. Believe me, there are things out there, in this vast, sprawling, uncharted country of ours, so much of which has not ever been explored, that few have actually seen. But there are things out there, you know, things that you can't even begin to imagine. And one of them is the Wendigo. Well, I have heard about it before. I read somewhere that it's cannibalistic, like an evil spirit with deer horns and an emaciated body. That's about all I know about it. I think it is something to do with Native American folklore, isn't it? But I always believed it was a legend. You think it's a legend, do you, my dear? Said Sylvia, unable to suppress a mocking laugh. Where do you think legends come from? Do you really believe they were birthed from someone's fertile imagination? They'd certainly have to have a good one, I must say. I think not. Let me tell you, my darling, that even if you think I'm a few stones short of a chimney, I'll say this. Legends are born from intrinsic truths. There is no doubt about that in my mind. Do you know a long, long time ago, around the Great Lakes in the days of old, people travelled on those lakes. They went everywhere by horseback and by foot. They saw things that they could not explain, and would go back and tell about these oddities to their friends and families. They took notes, and that's where legends came about. It was people who spent all their days out in nature, and one of the things observed by many witnesses was the Wendigo. And when you have an encounter with such a guileful, malevolent beast, you rarely ever escape with your life. You're very lucky if you do. So more to the point, what is the Wendigo? No one really truly knows, my dear. But it is a giant, gargantuan, well, very large skeletal creature. It's cannibalistic. And it's supernatural, I'm told. Like you say, it has antlers on its head. But believe me, the creature is real. I very nearly succumbed to its treachery when I first moved here to Stana. As you can imagine, I was in a very bad place at the time. And of course, I couldn't believe it when I actually encountered the creature. So yes, I have seen the Wendigo. So I know it is not just folklore. It's not some kind of an American legend. It's real. This time I was shocked. I hasten to say Sylvia was quirky, eccentric, maybe a little cuckoo, but when she spoke about the Wendigo with such conviction, it sent chills down my spine. For she spoke with the sober earnestness of one who rarely has encountered a great evil. Do you mind telling me about it, Sylvia? Sylvia began to shake violently, as if recalling the story brought her much terror. I reached out to grab her hand. She still trembled. I can see I've distressed you, Sylvia. You don't have to tell me. It's not important. Oh, but that is where you're very wrong, my dear. I do need to tell you all about it, said Sylvia warningly. I simply must. For if I don't, the Wendigo might seduce your naivety. To his advantage. You could end up becoming one of his victims. You forget, my darling, Stana is in the middle of nowhere out here. We're surrounded by so much nature. Things that others will never see are in those woods. And that's what you must begin to appreciate and understand. I waited for Sylvia to tell me her story, not knowing what to make of it all. When I first came here to Stana, I was glad to escape London, especially after learning that our home in Knightsbridge had been brought down in flames. But thankfully no one was at home at the time. But we did have those automatic lights that would go on and off, so it looked deceptively as if we were in, which was such a saving grace, I have to say. That evil man, Theodore, was very much behind the burning down of our home in Knightsbridge. I'm in no doubt about that. As you can imagine, my ballet career went up in smoke, lying around me in burned smithereens, my whole life an absolute mess, all because of a girl called Rosa. If I returned to England, my life was in perilous danger. There was no doubt about that in my mind, the mind of my parents, in the mind of my uncle and aunt. We knew that as a given. If Theodore got word that I was very much alive, I was the walking dead, nothing less, nothing more. That man was capable of many atrocities. There were rumours about the dreadful things he'd done at the time. And unfortunately he's one of those men that have gotten away with his duplicity all his life, because he knows people in high places, so he is able to keep the lid on everything that he does. I knew that living here with my uncle at Stana was my only sanctuary. I was very broken up at the time, knowing that the girl Rosa was going around telling everyone that I'd pushed her down the stairs in a fit of jealous rage. Well, that's what she said. Some believed her, which was so tragic. Imagine how my reputation was now in tatters. Everybody thought I was this violent, aggressive, very jealous individual. I'm most sure that only happened in her mind that I pushed her down the stairs. It was all fabricated. I think she wanted to believe I had pushed her down the stairs, for it absolved her of the responsibility concerning her own actions, that she wasn't looking where she was going when she fell. I gather she was inebriated at the time, having drunk rather too much champagne to celebrate the great news of being the lead dancer in Swan Lake. Now, after that fortuitous fall, her career was cremated by her disability, mine by her lies and her brother that wanted to kill me, and his promises were not remotely empty. As far as Rosa was concerned, if she couldn't dance in Swan Lake as the lead dancer, why should I? And more to the point, why not ruin not only her own career, but my reputation while you're about it? So there we are. That is the end of part 2. Isn't it an exciting story? I'm so glad you're joining in, and tomorrow night I look forward to you joining me again. Until next time, goodbye and good night.